Hello, everyone. Hello, Moose Jaw, and welcome to, I guess we're calling it Fantasy Island. I am your host, Wayne Arthurson. I am a Cree and writer of Cree and French Canadian descent from Treaty 5, and I live in Treaty 6. And welcome our viewers here on virtual Fantasy Island panel with three wonderful writers, Hiromi Goto, Melanie McFarlane, and C.L. Polk. And before we start, we will do a land acknowledgement and a safe space policy. And as someone of Cree descent, I love reading people's land acknowledgements, and this one is really good. The Festival of Words takes place and is broadcasting from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, located on the traditional lands referred to as Treaty 4 territory. The original lands are the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homelands of the Métis Nation. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we are committed to moving forward in partnership with the Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We feel it's important for us to acknowledge Treaty 4, but would like to point out that this is more than just a string of words or token used in reconciliation. So tonight, we invite everyone in attendance to consider how acknowledgement of treaty lands goes beyond the words themselves into something more mindful and meaningful, and where we are active participants working to reconcile and rebuild relationships with Indigenous peoples whom we share treaty territories. That's a wonderful treaty acknowledgement. Well done. And now we do the safe space policy. We prioritize equity and the mental and emotional safety of marginalized groups, people of color, LGBTQ+, and disabled people, etc., over the comfort of others. This is a safe place for everyone, and hate speech, insults, and rude comments will not be tolerated. If you see something that concerns you, please contact one of the moderators or the festival directly. Again, these wonderful statements you see coming out are fantastic. So now we will move on to the wonderful part that we call the author readings, where the authors will read a couple pages from their books. And going up first, who drew the number one in the lottery was Melanie McFarlane. She's the author of a number of book series for tweens and teens, including the Dome 16-8 series, the Law of Summoning series, and the Descendants series. Her new book is a standalone novel called Finders Keepers. I believe it's a standalone. I'm not sure, but she can correct me if I'm wrong. And it's a wonderful novel for tweens about kids and their wonderful adventures involving a creature from the depths. Melanie also plays an important role in supporting emerging writers, good for her, as being a part of the Teen Author Camp Conference, as well as being the co-editor of the Teen Author Camp Poetry Collection. So good job helping emerging writers, because that's very important. So Melanie, go ahead and read something from your wonderful book, Finders Keepers.
Thanks, Wayne. So yes, as Wayne mentioned, I'm reading from Finders Keepers. This is my first book published with a Canadian publisher, I just want to add. So I'm pretty proud of it. My other books are with American publishers, so it's definitely a favorite now. I mean, are any of our books, like one of our books, our favorites? I don't know, but I'm going to call this my favorite book baby right now. So chapter 1. I dug deep into the muddy sand. I was looking for treasure at the bottom of the lake, but the more I dug, the darker the water got. Then something soft touched my foot. I froze. What was it, a weed? Or worse, a hungry fish? I was a treasure hunter, not a diver. I needed to get out of here. As soon as my head popped out of the water, I gasped for air. I was at the very far end of the marked swimming area. I thought again about what could be moving around below me. Why had I swum out so far? I knew if Mum were here, she'd tell me to just take a breath, that my active imagination was always working overtime. But she was at work right now. She's a park ranger for Buffalo Pound Provincial Park. That's why we live here. I love living at the lake. I can ride my bike anywhere I want to go. I have hills to explore, and my best friend Sam lives close by, so we can hang out most days. But the lake water hides a ton of scaly creatures that make me nervous. Have you ever seen a fish up close? Their big eyes, spiky fins, and sharp teeth make them look like monsters. Hurry up, Macy, Sam called from the shore. He was standing next to my little brother. Real nice. They left me alone out here to be fish food. I looked around, trying to figure out the fastest way out of the lake. Old Lady Wilson's dock was to the right. In front of me was the beach. To my left were tall reeds. They were a bit closer. Oh, but I hate the feel of moving through them. Something soft touched my foot again. The creature found me. This time it grabbed onto my toes. Ah, I screamed, kicking my feet furiously. I wasn't letting go. I swam as fast as I could toward the beach. When I reached the shallow water, I tried to stand but slipped on the thing attached to my foot. I fell back into the water and grabbed at my toes. Oh, it was just a chunk of lakeweed. I laughed. But then I remembered that leeches and other creepy crawlers love to hide in lakeweed. I stood up quickly. I looked down at my feet to make sure there was nothing nearby. That's when I spotted something sparkly under the water. I had to investigate. Finding things is kind of my thing. I started digging carefully, like I learned from my handbook, Treasure Hunting 101. Rule number 1, always protect the scene. My fingers found something solid. It felt like a bottle. I pulled it out of the sand and held it over my head like a trophy. I had found the first treasure of the day. And that's where I'll stop. Thanks, everyone.
That's a wonderful reading, and although it did bring up traumatic images of leeches in Alberta lakes. If you swim in Alberta lakes, they do happen, and I have this image of my dad with a cigarette and a leech attached to my leg, which is another story entirely. I wish it was a fantasy. Our next reader, Hiromi Goto, is a BC writer, the author of 7 books, and her first novel, Course of Mushrooms, is my opinion a seminal work of Canadian fiction and should be read by all. And her first graphic novel, Shadow Life, with artist Anne Zhu, was published in the spring of 2021, and it's a wonderful book. It's a wonderful graphic novel of a woman and her life, and gets into all this fantastic stuff going on. And while I'm a fan of her writing, I also must mention I'm a fan of her photography and her social media posts, which are tagged under A Little Beauty every day. And it's been very helpful for me and other people during the pandemic. So thank you for that as well. So I'm curious to see how you're going to read from the graphic novel. So this is going to be fun. So here's the book. Shadow Life is probably reversed, but it's a wonderful book as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. I will be reading from chapter 2 of the script of the graphic novel. Someone a bit more, tech savvy than me would have sort of like the screen images of the actual pages of the graphic novel, but I don't have the capacity and I don't care. So I'm just going to read from the script. And this will actually give you sort of a behind the scenes look of what the artist receives as the material that she goes on to illustrate. So chapter 2. Close-up aerial view of Kumiko's face, eyes closed, water lapping her hair and cheeks. Hair length goes to just around her jawline and nape of neck. Goggles are hanging, floating around her neck. White hair, face wrinkled, a little sun damage. Looks relaxed. She opens eyes, sees from her vantage point the large expanse of glass in the high ceiling, the reflection of the public swimming pool, blueness of water, the old woman's floating body. She can't see outside because it's night. Dark. View from outside, the skylight looking in, pan further back. There's a silhouette of a rounded animal-like head, size of a small cat, that's ambiguous, uncanny. It's looking down at the old woman. She's floated into the middle of the lane, her arms and legs spread wide. She has a short and sturdy body, round tummy, floats well. She closes her eyes. Kumiko, thinking. It was so difficult to trust water again after Samuel's accident. 4 years before I understood. It wasn't water's fault. Flashback image of the back end of a car sinking into the water, the front end already submerged. Cutaway. Kumiko, still floating on water, opens her eyes, glances at the clock on the wall. Almost 10 p.m. She swings legs down and brings torso upright to tread water slowly. Kumiko, thinking. It was just his time to leave this world. It's the living who struggle to accept death. Ducking beneath the lane marker, she slowly breaststrokes across the empty lanes to get to the little ladder at the side. Lifeguard number 1, woman mid-40s, is hosing down the deck. Grins. Lifeguard number 1. You float like a cork. Kumiko ponders, pictures herself in treadwater position, morphing into a cork, which morphs again into a fat fur seal. Kumiko smiles, picks up swimming bag from hooks on the wall, walks carefully across wet slippery floor towards women's changing room. Kumiko, Sedna has watched over me my entire life. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great way to see how a script is done and what the artist gets. And the artist did a wonderful job with the illustrations and doing the story was quite fantastic. I'm a big fan of realism in graphic novels, but with a touch of fantasy as well. Our next reader, C.L. Polk, is the author of 4 novels, am I correct? Including 3 in the Kingston cycle. The first novel, Witchmark, was nominated for, this is an amazing list, the Nebula, the Lambda, the Locust, Aurora Awards, and the World Fantasy Award, and won the World Fantasy Award, which is a fantastic and amazing thing for a first novel to read. Their newest novel, The Midnight Bargain, was a finalist in the CBC Canada Reads competition. Excellent to get some more genre in there. And I'm not sure if it's going to be a series, but I sure hope so because I really enjoyed the story and the characters. They're quite fantastic. CL claims they live with too many books, which is a lie because no one lives with too many books because we're all writers. And has a yarn stash that claims could last a decade. So you should meet my mom because she's like 88. She keeps saying, I'm going to get rid of all my yarn before I die. And she keeps buying more. So she's going to keep living forever. So CL, read from your lovely book, The Midnight Bargain.
Okay, so I'm going to read from The Midnight Bargain. I'm going to read from chapter 13 because I'm feeling lucky. Isbetta thrust the book into Beatrice's hands the moment they boarded the landau. Lavin house, Cornelius, she ordered. Ianthe is seeking his own means later. But miss, go! The driver shrugged and guided the horses into the street, maneuvering through traffic to turn on Silk Row, aiming for the Meryton Highway. Beatrice looked behind her one more time, but the landau was long past Pigment Street. You left him? He can hire a cab. Isbetta lounged in her seat in an unladylike slouch. If I had to listen to him ask me what was wrong for the entire journey, I would have thrown him out of the carriage anyway, at speed. Her hand came up to trace a line across her neck. What's the book about? Beatrice glanced at the driver, who kept to the business of driving the horses in a trot through the streets of Pendleton. She made the sign and cast a spell, blinking at the title. Hazel and Chestnut, The Hidden Path of Women. What is this? Beatrice murmured and kept reading. Oh, what is it? Isbetta asked. One moment, Beatrice said, and read on with rising excitement. I was right. Of course I was right, but here's proof. What were you right about? There is a hidden network of women practitioners. They're probably the ones who make the grimoires, Beatrice said. They signal each other with Hazel and Chestnut for wisdom and warning. I know, Isbetta said, but they're the sign of women who practice in secret? Exactly, Beatrice said. We can find other sorceresses. Maybe even a sorceress who knows the great bargain, someone who can help us. Not a moment too soon, Isbetta said. How do we find them? They mark themselves with a sign, embroidered on a handkerchief or the border of a shoe. We just have to keep our eyes open. Beatrice glanced behind her again, and Isbetta huffed. You're looking for Ianthe. We're long gone. I know, but will a cab go as far as Lavin House? He'll be fine. I will not. Has something happened? Beatrice asked. Bard Sheldon called on my father this morning, Isbetta said. He stayed for 25 minutes. Mother was all smiles. The jaws of this trap are closing. Isabella swallowed. I made a terrible mistake not collecting other suitors sooner, Beatrice. You have to help me. I understand you don't want to marry Bard. Or anyone, Isabella said. I never want to marry, never. I don't blame you. But what if you meet someone who stirs your heart? It won't happen, Isabella declared. No man or woman has ever turned my head. I know beauty when I see it, but my heart has never ached for anyone. No one? It's magic that stirs my senses, Isabella said. Writing my books, sailing to port after port, learning even the simplest charms brings me joy. That is what I must do to live a useful life. I must pursue knowledge of magic, preserve it, pass it on to the ones who thirst for it. My life will end the moment a warding collar wraps around my neck. Beatrice shuddered. You must never know what it's like. How do you know? My mother took me aside and put mine around my neck this very morning. Isabella lifted one hand to cover a soft gasp. That's supposed to be bad luck for you Chaslanders, isn't it? Bad luck, Beatrice grumbled. I wonder how many brides made a run for it before that particular superstition took hold. Why did she do that? Because she wanted me to know exactly what sorceresses sacrifice. She didn't know until it was too late. Does she not want you to marry? Isabella asked. Does she dislike Yanthe? That's not why she did it. Beatrice turned her head and watched cattle graze. She didn't want me to make a choice I will regret. I'm going to stop there.
Excellent reading. I love how the line of disdain. You can take a cab with just, and the warding collars are.
Yeah, they're creepy.
They're creepy, and this scene you described before that was like, wow. So we're going to get into the fun part where nothing is scripted or read. We're just going to make things up, except for my questions, which I scripted and read. But first, before we start, I got one thing I should say. If people are wondering why a crime writer is moderating a fantasy panel, it's because I probably read more science fiction and fantasy than I do crime fiction. So that's why I'm a big fan of the genre of all types. And of course, my most recent novel did have a bit of a, people call it magic realism, where the red Chesterfield kept appearing, but I just say what other people said, magic realism is the literary way of saying fantasy. So that's one reason why I'm here on Fantasy Island with these wonderful people. So if you want, we're going to start with the questions. And I think I don't want to get into questions of have you been or ever been a fantasy writer? Because if you want to answer the question, that's fine. But I think one way to start is to ask people, how do you find fantasy? What do you think it makes different from other genres or similar to other genres? So should we go reverse? CL, you want to start with that one?
Okay. Well, I mean, as a kid, I was a super pretender. Like, I love to daydream in my head about various things, and I read a lot of books, and so very often I would daydream myself as the neighbor to the Bobbsey twins, helping them solve the mystery. And this didn't really stop. So I found myself, as I was getting older, having these daydreams that became more and more elaborate and more and more speculative. So I would be daydreaming about a world where magic was real and what that meant. And so it just seemed natural to write fantasy stories because they're in my head anyway.
Excellent. Melanie, how do you define fantasy?
I don't write so much high fantasy as more, I don't know, I look it up and it sometimes it calls it low fantasy, but I'll just call it fantasy. But I like to have those elements just where something magical could happen in the real world. And like CL, we I grew up reading books and with a lot of imagination. We lived kind of at the edge of town on this little college campus, a really small campus. My mom was a cook. My dad was a maintenance man. So there was no trips to the library or anything like that. It was just my imagination. And there was a little mini woods behind us, train tracks and a bridge on the other side. And then it went down into Moose Jaw's Guacamo Valley. And gosh, I remember playing games, sending my brothers up just a couple little steps of of a fire escape with a bag full of books telling him it was a parachute. My mom came out running, to stop him. But there was also like this great hole in the ground that was just like an underground kind of, I guess, what did we call it? I can't remember now, but just like a pantry, like for storage of potatoes and stuff like that. And that was outside. And then I remember reading The Hobbit and thinking, like, that's where a hobbit could have lived, and that's kind of like putting those elements into that world to make it that little bit more place. So that's where I just love that it's not so much that like Deus Ex Machina, where something just could happen unexpectedly. I just like to have that element and make you in the end believe, geez, that really could have happened, like in Finders Keepers, you could really maybe you could find a mermaid in the middle of the prairies in a lake. Who knows what's under those muddy prairie lakes?
Leeches, but mermaids are nicer. Hiromi, how would you define fantasy?
I was thinking about, like, do I actually define fantasy? I think I did when I was facilitating creative writing workshops, but I don't know that I think about the definition of fantasy per se as a creative process. So I really love the idea of the possible magical. And I would say I come to writing elements of the fantastic in my stories quite liberally, without actually thinking about whether it's going to fall into fantasy or if it'll be literary enough, or I don't care about those things in particular. In the writing stage, I'm just like trying to imagine or explore something, a sort of a thought process. But there is also a really, like, as people have mentioned, sort of a deep connection to an imaginary life, or sort of, connections to the magical from farther back in childhood. And I think the imagination was actually a place one could go to and feel safe and secure in, was one's imagination. At least it was for me. And also a connection to the older stories like legends and folk tales, where the magical just happens. Like, a tanuki can turn into a kettle, and they just do. And so those kinds of ideas, they really resonated for me as a young reader. And there's also the logic of dream logic, where things just happen in your dream. Like, it's just, and you don't question it. It's just is, like, all of a sudden you're running, across, running away from someone, and then you leap up into the air and you're flying. And it's possible in your dream. And so I like to bring like those kind of qualities of being into the story. And I think it opens things up in narrative in interesting ways.
You mentioned something, and it probably was going to my next question, and I'll pose it to the other two, because you answered that question. It was like, when you're writing a book, do you think this is going to be a such and such insert genre kind of book, and these are some of the conventions that maybe I'll follow or I won't? Or do you just write with no genre in mind, and focus on the story? And Melanie, we can go with you with that one first and see.
Sure. I have gone from being a pantser to a plotter to, back and forth, right? But I think I just enjoy writing so much more when I just write that first draft, how it wants to come out. And then you can always edit it for pace and plot, but also for like those elements like needed in fantasy, if they will fit. And often I find that's where like other pieces can kind of tie together, or maybe like new ideas will filter in when I do that. But if I bring too much of that in the beginning, it just starts to feel like work, and I lose that bit of enjoyment just in the initial part. And I find that's where often, like, I'm not really a big believer in writer's block, but that's where often a manuscript will just get put aside for a new idea because that new idea just wants to come out, right? But then, kind of towards the middle or somewhere you'll get a stumble a bit, usually, if you're like me. But yeah, so I think, no, from the beginning. First draft, just go with it, write it, I say, and I do. And then bring the rest in later. So, yeah.
CL, the same question?
I the only time I don't write a fantasy novel is when I'm writing a science fiction short story. This is where I live. Whenever I think of a story, it comes to me, and I kind of have the mottos. Like, if somebody is not casting a spell, what are you even doing? I'm very firmly inside the fantasy genre. It's what I write. It's what comes naturally to me. It's what I am most fascinated by. So that is what I do.
Okay. I understand it completely, because it doesn't matter what, even though if I'm writing a science fiction story, if there's not a dead body somewhere in the first few pages, it's like, what's going on? There has to be a dead person. And I don't know where that comes from. It just seems to be, I just fall into crime fiction, and I'm much better at that than I am at fantasy and science fiction.
I love throwing a good mystery into a story, but those spells have to be there.
And I love the fact that all your stories, they're fantasy stories. They could also be sort of like crossovers in a sense. I mean, Hiromi, yours is a graphic novel, but it's also a character study about this older woman. CL, yours is also, in a sense, a Regency romance. And Melanie, your book is, a coming of age, young kids having an adventure story that happens to have a fantasy element. It could be just kids in the prairie having a good time. So that's why I think I love those parts of your story. And so can we maybe talk more? I'm just rambling here about crossovers and the whole genre of fantasies and things like that. Did you want to include, see how many of your books are like this? Like, it's also a romance at the same time.
Yeah, I kind of have this thing where I kind of see fantasy as a genre of setting, and like a romance or a mystery is a genre of plot. So I find them very compatible with each other. And like, why only write one genre if you could have four? Like, why not? Like, mush them together. Like, some of my favorite fantasy novels, even to this day, are fantasy mystery novels written by Barbara Hambly. Bride of the Rat God is a terrific book. Like, it's just like, it's a historical study of golden age Hollywood. There's a murder mystery and there's magic, and it's just this perfect kind of blending of like this feeling of noir, and I like really appreciate it. She wrote fantasy novels in high fantasy settings with full-on murder mysteries, where there was a sleuth, and the whole story was a mystery, but it was set in a fantasy world, and it's like, oh wow, I love this. I need to do this.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of those kind of things. I love Alex Bledsoe's Eddie Lacrosse things, which is a private detective, but he happens to be a knight in a fantasy world. So it's kind of fun like that. Anybody want to comment on the thing about crossovers and combining genres? Melanie, Hiromi, want to say about? Go ahead.
Well, CL, I love the idea of framing as fantasy as part of the setting, and romance as an element of plot. Like, so that just kind of blew my mind right now. So thank you very much. I love that. It's like conceptually really interesting way to approach those things. I think when I'm writing, I'm doing, I think most of my stories are character-based stories. So that I'm really, really interested in characters, their psychology, emotional states, their behaviors, influenced by their circumstances, history, trauma, all sorts of things, and the moment and relationships. So I very, very character based. But the fantastic is an element of the world that can erupt at any moment. So, people are just kind of living their lives and doing their things. And then the fabric between a realist world and a fantastic world, I find to be very thin, and it's sort of the sort of that in between state to be quite wide, and then there's incursions from both sides, and I feel like I kind of live my life that way in many ways. I experience like some moments to be magical or really kind of out of this world, but not like because I'm tripping, but I'm kind of like tripping on real life sometimes. I can't explain it, but it just like you're just like, wow, this is so beautiful. This is so amazing. And it feels almost magical, like I'm inhabiting almost a magical place. So then I can amplify that experience in a fictional world to whatever extent I like. And so that's, sort of the world building part, and the creative part of the fantastic is that you could just really like it, really blow out in this marvelous way.
I love how you talked about that, because there's a wonderful part in Shadow World where there's a great use of fantasy and realism of a vacuum cleaner, which is perfect description. I'm not going to tell anybody in case I haven't read the book yet. It's just this perfect use of a vacuum cleaner in the fantasy world, and it's just wonderful. Melanie, your work is more geared towards a younger audience, YA. You think that, and you did mention you write more of what we call low fantasy, high fantasy. I hate these kind of things. Do you feel restrained when you do that, or do you approach the genre differently than those who may write for adults?
I guess I feel like I have maybe. I guess I really don't know to compare myself for writing for adults, but I just feel like I have that room to play when I'm writing for kids. What I really like about this book, like this is part of Orca Books, their Currents line. So this is a high-low reader. So it's high interest, which means we're just going to have that single plot line. We're not going to have a bunch of other, subplots happening. But it's also, and we're trying to like not so much use the low vocab part of the high-low wording. It's like an easy read. So all your chapters are going to end, not like a big cliffhanger, but enough where it's going to keep that struggling reader to turn the next page. But it's also there's not going to be many words to stumble. So this is intended for middle readers, but it has a grade 3 reading level, right? So it was great, enjoyable that I could read it with my oldest, who's in grade 8, read it in a night. She's just a good reader. My younger daughter is not a good reader. She's in grade 3. I don't want to say she's a good reader, not a good reader, but she struggles. Like she just doesn't. It's an argument and a fight to get her to read every night. So graphic novels, thank goodness for kids' graphic novels, like picking up so much, because both my kids, that's where we kind of went from picture books to chapter books. I just couldn't get them into chapter books, and everyone would be like, "Oh, you're an author. Your kids must be big readers," and I'd be like, "No, it's so that's where I really like these high lows as that bridge." And then you can explore like the crossing genre kind of part in them. I like that you can just focus on one thing. So like this is like Macy's anxiety with change, right? She doesn't like under the lake water because it's scary. They're going to have to move because her mom got a job in the city. She doesn't want to move to the city. She likes living at the lake, right? So it just kind of deals with this one anxiety that a kid can relate to. And there aren't a lot of fantasy high lows. So, I mean, gosh, I'm going to tell everyone here to take a look at these submissions and get some books in, because kids, like, let's start, and that's where we start our reading, our fans, right, as young. So I do like that I can play. I feel like maybe I have a little more room to play into the YA. I mean, it's that industry gets a little bit more strict on each other. and stuff with how things are written. And I can imagine it just that filters up into writing for adults. So when I write younger, I feel like I just have that bit more room to breathe and just have some fun, maybe.
That's great. And despite it's I'm not gonna say despite, but it's written for younger readers or readers who have difficulties who may not be younger, but it's still a very entertaining story. I really enjoyed the fact it was like every page ended with some cliffhangers. Oh my God, what happens next? And you want to keep going. Hence the thing it's called a page turner, I believe it's called on the thing, which is excellent. Good page turner, go buy it. CL, in many fantasy worlds, we did talk about this. It was mentioned about world building can be a key element to the story, and your worlds they have everything. It's the political, social, economic systems, everything like that. So how much work does that play in the development of your stories? Do you build it? Yeah, go ahead.
I like it varies from book to book. Like sometimes I don't really prepare too much at all. Like Witchmark, I just basically said constitutional monarchy, skyscrapers, bicycles, go. And I just went for it. And when I needed something, I would just stop, think about it, think about what fit and put it in. And I got away with it. So that's just fine. With the Midnight Bargain, I had to think a little bit more because I wanted like the world is it's quite capitalist instead of basically being this thing where the countries would like arm up and go and beat up other countries and take their stuff. I had this thing where explorers met each other and said, hey, do you have anything cool to trade? And it's like, oh yeah, I got this thing over here. And so basically the world is different because it's about like what you can buy and what you can sell. And I did that on purpose because I wanted it to kind of have that. Like, okay, we didn't have war, but it's still not perfect kind of thing going on. And like a whole bunch of choices cascaded down from that single choice. And like, I had to like chase them all, in order to put them in the book. And then like, I wrote a short story where I literally had to come up with a map of the city in order to figure out like the magic system superimposed on top of the city. So it really all depends on what the story needs. I can do a little or I can do a lot. I find that doing a lot is more fun.
I don't want to give away secrets of writers. Like I just had 3 ideas and started, and it became a story, and all these readers going, oh, but I thought you planned it all in advance. You're going, man, I just killed someone. For me, it's just I just killed someone and moved from there. And that's just it was kind of like I've loved that part. One thing you about your story, CL, is like, and all the other stories, they're not just about romance and fantasy and magic and magical things and mermaids. They're about other things, other deeper things. And you think I get this from crime writers, like we can hide our messages in our plots. Do you feel fantasy has that ability, like instead of beat people over the head of this is the message of the book, you just sort of hide that, quietly float that through there?
I think for a while, a lot of people believed that speculative fiction as social commentary was kind of the territory of science fiction, and the fantasy was like magic, kings, wizards, horses, stew on the road. And it's changed. Now you can like make up a world and you can use it to speculate on like what would this country be like if they did this. And then it's just an exercise, like a thought exercise, as you run through the consequences and discover that, you know what, there are still problems, but they are incredibly interesting ones. So let's go.
Anybody else want to comment? Hiromi, you want to comment? Because your story is fantastic, but it's also about people finding their own voice or their own life, even at a later age.
Yeah, I'm highly conscious of sort of the social critical elements to stories, whether they are intentional or unintentional. So I never think of stories as sort of neutral sites, no matter how they're written, whether they're overtly politicized or if it's written under the sort of, under the framework of this is not a political book, which I think is an extremely political statement. So I'm conscious of ideas around social justice, history, trauma, um, all these things are sitting with me while I'm writing story. And so for Shadow Life, one of the beautiful things about the graphic novel is that it's a visual representation. And the visual representation that basically keeps the readers focus on the character. So here we have in Kumiko a 76-year-old Asian North American woman who's fat, older, and not normally perceived as a hero or a main character in any kind of broader cultural context, in terms of Hollywood or mainstream ideas of the heroic, or worth reading, paying attention to. So having her physicality on the page, just occupying that space, for me, I think is a in itself a sort of a powerful statement. It is, at least for me, and I delight in it.
Is that one reason I was going to talk about the graphic novel? Why you went with the graphic novel? Was it another story you thought about and you thought maybe I want to do more of the visual? And how did you approach the writing when you switched it over to, or if you didn't switch it over, when you approached the graphic novel?
I was curious about the form. I started reading more graphic novels. Also, with a longer history of reading manga from Japan, which has long been very, very popular before graphic novels started becoming a thing in North America. This long tradition of the visual narrative. And so I was curious about the form. My children were reading a lot of it. And I was curious how the process would be like, moving from writing novels to how I would write for a graphic novel. So it was kind of like a creative, technical challenge. I was like, that'd be interesting. And I really enjoyed it because it's actually fewer words than writing a novel for an adult. So writing an adult graphic novel script were far fewer words than writing an adult novel. So that was kind of exciting. But I think the jump from novel writing to graphic novel script wasn't too far of a leap for me because I'm actually a very visual writer to begin with. So when I'm writing the novels for non-visual tales, I basically see a movie in my head, like scene at a time. So I see a mini movie in my head, and then I translate the mini movie into words. And so it wasn't too far of a leap, but it was it's an interesting constraint as well. And I also found that I had to have a tighter plot because I really wanted it to be a plot-based story, a visually plot-based story. But also you have to reduce so much dialogue as well because it has to like fit in that little bubble. And I also wanted to avoid narration. So there was all these kind of constraints that it was really a neat experience. I highly recommend it.
Okay, that's great. We're getting questions from the chat. So the first question is for everyone. Anybody can jump in when they answer it. For me, it's a bit of a long one. As fantasy writers who are not white men, does the fantasy writing community create meaningful and safe place for fantasy writers that are women, members of LGBT+ community? especially since stereotypically high fantasy is seen as a genre created by men like Tolkien and Lewis. And what is unique about the exciting about works of female and LGBTQ plus fantasy writers like Pamela Dean, Ursula Gwynn, and Kate Jameson? Sorry, that was a long question. So anybody want to jump in and answer that one? Is it seen as a safe place, the fantasy writing community, for people who aren't white dudes?
I think it's better than it used to be, and that it is improving. But you are going to walk into some issues, and the issues are the ones that you would normally expect. One of the things is the relative invisibility of fantasy writers who are not basically half a dozen white guys, and Robin Hobb, of course. They are on top of the heap. Everybody has read them. Everybody discusses their books at length. If you ask for a recommendation, you can basically set a stopwatch to time how long it takes before you get a recommendation of one of these authors, and it won't take very long. So like we have some writers who are definitely on the top of the heap, and they get a lot of notice, and everybody else just kind of slides through and gets, what they can. And that's pretty good. But if you're looking for fame and fortune, you're probably not going to find it.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to comment on that?
I would.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Well, I was just going to say, maybe, I've always been with small presses, so I maybe don't see it as much with that, but I'm more involved with the indie writing community than most of the traditional published. And I mean, I am traditionally published. My first 3 books are like that, and my last one, but my Descendant series is through an author co-op. I find the indie author community, with the hybrid authors and the self-published authors, incredibly supportive of one another. Like, it's beyond anything I've ever seen. And that's with helping, promote books, get sales, get readers, grouping things together. It is something, and I see a good division there of female authors and representation, but there can always be more, I think, right? It's not everyone wants to go that route. That route often has its own challenges in being seen or being recognized. So it's, but it definitely is one I found quite heavily supportive of one another. So.
Hiromi, any comment or?
Yeah, I think there are movements toward within the industry. I think there are movements towards trying to address long-standing gaps in publishing and greater awareness. I think that there's shifts towards change in editor perspectives. It's not just a matter of audiences, but it's also the diversity of the authors. And we want more diverse authors to be published and stories be appreciated and shared and talked about. But there's a whole industry as well, and I don't. I think there's so many writers, but then there's the whole publishing industry, and who are the editors, and then behind the editors you have the publishing houses, and they are capitalist entities, so their bottom line is going to be very much guided by money. For this I'm talking about big presses, so they're going to be making certain kinds of decisions around who they're going to publish. And so if the publisher imagines a certain kind of writer is more identifiable than another kind of writer, then therefore sell more books, it doesn't matter how amazing our stories are. You could be like not imagined as an identifiable author or an identifiable story. So I really appreciate Melanie's point about independent publishing and small presses. I would say small presses have always been very supportive of the more sort of critical and radical stories that I've written. And I know and believe in my heart there's always a place for those more radical books. The independent publishers, especially the ones I know in Canada, put out these amazing risky books that might not ever be considered marketable from a mainstream viewpoint. But so that gives me hope. But I also do see changes in the sort of broader industry, like changing names of major awards so that they're no longer named from long-standing bigots from the past. Good things, like topple those statues. So those signs are promising, and I feel a lot of hope for the new waves of editors coming up through the ranks as well.
Yeah, I'm always surprised by the publishing industry because they go like, this is a niche market or things like that. And you're going like, and then they're surprised that something that they weren't expecting to sell sells. And the old stuff is just sort of, so if they're capitalists, they see there's money to be made in these equity-seeking communities, and in the mainstream, who's looking for different stories. Considering the number of fantasy shows and movies on streaming things, there's a ton of them, and some are good, some are bad, some are interesting. Do you think that could be a good thing for fantasy books and fantasy writers, or has it become a hindrance? Because maybe there is that capitalist thing. We are expecting all the fantasy books to be like Game of Thrones or Witcher, and big tough guys cut people's heads off. So you can see my opinion on it. I think sometimes it can be a hindrance, but sometimes do you think it could be more positive because people are seeing more different stories? Anybody want to jump in and answer that one?
I think there's an amazing variety of readers out there, because, and that people are more eclectic in their tastes than somebody might originally think. One of the things that I was worried about with my books was that not many people were going to read them, that I was targeting an extremely limited audience. And so I was very surprised when people who were outside of that audience I had perceived for myself were like, I really like this. This is so much fun. When are you writing another one? And so I have a lot more trust in the idea that, my book is going to get out there. Your books are going to get to people because they're going to read it. They're going to think it's great. And then they're going to tell all their friends. So it'll spread this way. The business considerations of being like published by honestly, fairly big publishers. It's there. I know it's there, but in my experience, what I get is, my editor is great. My art director is great. Everybody wants me to do well. Everybody wants me to produce an excellent story. And that's really like what they want. Yeah, there's a spreadsheet over here, and I know I'm on it and I'm being evaluated, but we're not going to look at that right now. We're going to concentrate on this.
I'm actually very excited about what might be happening in terms of more diverse stories, diverse, and by diverse I mean like non-heteronormative white stories coming up, because I really enjoyed the Expanse, for instance. I thought that was really, really engaging, and there's like a fabulous cast of characters, and I know, and N.K. Jameson's Broken Earth trilogy is being developed. So like, I'm just like waiting for my mind to be blown when that's going to be on the screen. It was like, wow. So I think I think there's definitely a desire by the broader audiences to read and view more diverse stories, that they're not fringe, but like looking at demographics of major cities, like they're very, very diverse places. And so I have like a great deal of excitement to see where we're going to go in terms of representation, content, and the different kinds and shapes of stories that will be coming down the chute. Because also, it's not just the characters or the our physical bodies in these stories, but also like the structure of narrative, like what's going to happen to the forms themselves, like the shape of stories or how to arrange a story. Like those things I think would be like really exciting too, when like that kind of starts to expand further in terms of what's possible.
Mhm. Melanie, any comments about how TV could be hindrance or help, or we're going to see more in the way of diverse stories from, because now people seem to be not open to it, but now it's like now they're more exposed to it than it was in the past.
I would say the more the merrier. Like, bring it on. I want those diverse voices. I want authenticity in the stories. I'll binge watch anything fantasy, science fiction. I mean, when I grew up on Star Trek, it was like a nightly show here, not so much fantasy, but I mean, in my mind, it is, there's a point where science fiction is fantasy, but yeah, bring it on. I want more. So I can't, like, it's like a reader, right? I finish a book, honestly. I'll finish a series I just love. Like, I'm just pick out of the top of my head, The Hunger Games. When I remember years ago when it came out, reading it as each came out, and like, where's more series like this? Like, I think there just can't be too much. Like, flood the market. I'm one of those readers who just wants to devour everything. I'm a Netflix binge watcher, right? Bring on more, and I want the different ways. Like when the Umbrella Academy came to screen, lots of people didn't like the storyline. I almost saw it like a way to turn like something like a graphic novel into something visual, like film, right? The way it kind of chopped up a lot of the story. I love it. Like, and all different kind of ways. I think it just gives us even different ideas as writers on how to change our story approach. Like, why does it always have to be the same? Not that fantasy ever is, but it gives us those different ideas too. And I don't know about you guys, like, when I wrote my first book, I was trying to get like into a sad mood to write a sad scene. I think I watched Dumbledore die like, 20 times just so I could get into that sad feel, so I could know how my character should feel. And so, yeah, I love all elements of fantasy, whether it's TV or books. We're always going to have readers. The more shows there are, if anything, maybe will eventually bring us people who haven't been readers, back to books where they likely started. So, yeah.
I know we're past the 5-minute mark, and they have all these questions, and some of them are kind of long, so I'm not going to ask them. I'm going to ask this one because some of the people maybe watching this could be non-fantasy readers, and they may be going, where do I start? So let's go with start with Melanie, and maybe give me your gateway drug book into fantasy, or two. I don't know. Go from there.
Well, we were big, like I said, we didn't really live by a library, so my gateway was Narnia, and The Hobbit. That's where we kind of started. I was younger when I read Narnia, I think grade 5, 6, and in grade 8, my mom made the family do like a Hobbit, Lord of the Rings challenge. Lord of the Rings maybe like a little too much when you're just getting in, but start with The Hobbit. Start there with those, and but we've got tons of great Canadian fantasy authors as well, right? Like, we've got Art Slade here in Saskatchewan, who's written, a number of excellent fantasy books. Crimson is one of his newer ones. He's got Death by Airship, which is an Orca current, as well. So a good for a struggling reader. So you'll find a ton of great options, in your own province, in here in Canada as well to start out. So.
Romy, any sort of gateway drug book that you would recommend for people who want to get into fantasy? Doesn't have to be one of the traditional ones, whatever you think people would enjoy and go, I want to read more.
I'm actually really bad at this game.
Okay, you're done.
Wait,
Thanks for playing.
No, because I have like a very patchy recall of titles. Like I can I could describe a plot of something, but I have my filing system is not great in there. But for someone who isn't, someone who's like fantasy reading is not their thing, and they want to kind of work their way into it, I would suggest reading like several collections of folk legends from all over the world, not just the more familiar ones, but worldwide folk tales, like maybe an anthology of folk tales from all over the world, and then start reading works of fantastic fiction that brings in folk tales, like thinking of Larissa Ly's When Fox Was 1,000. So bringing in sort of the folk creature of sort of the magical fox from Chinese legends into a contemporary setting. So then you have that sort of kind of like the original story from the folk historical context, and then it's in a contemporary reality. And then you have this merging of it's a kind of like a time travel of that folk character from its origins to its place in a contemporary imaginary. And I think that's pretty neat.
CL, any suggestions?
I would have to carefully curate my answer to anybody who asks me, like, according to like what they read already. Because I can't just throw them in the deep end and say like, you should read the 5th season. Training wheels, people. So like if they are a Jane Austen fan, I would say, well, you should probably start with Shades of Milk and Honey by Mary Robinette Kowal, because it's got that element of familiar territory that they can get comfortable with, and with the added bit of magic so that they can get used to it. I'm just trying to think. If they read spy novels and thrillers, I would recommend The Witch Who Came In From the Cold, which is a serial that is a whole team of people headed by Max Gladstone. It's set in like Eastern Europe in the early 70s. It is like Cold War spycraft plus witches. So I would think, that's the way you want to go. And like if they are like, I like to read like stuff about ancient history, I would say, okay, well, read The Just City by Jo Walton, which is basically a fantasy novel experiment where she takes the principles of, I believe it's Aristotle, about like what a just society looks like, and rolls with it. If they if they already enjoy, like, say, supernatural television, specifically the TV show Supernatural, I would probably like send them to Ilana Gordon to read some of her stuff. Like, I would definitely be looking at like the urban fantasy PNR kind of angle that way. If they're like, well, I like Sherlock Holmes, I would recommend Angel of the Crows by Catherine Addison. So I would just like basically take the genre that they already read and then find them a book that has that genre plus fantasy.
That's an awesome plan. Excellent. Well, thank you all three for this wonderful discussion. If you are looking for the gateway drug books into the fantasy genre, all three of their books that we've talked about here are perfect gateways to get in there. So thank you all for coming. It was a wonderful night, and enjoy the rest of the festival. And I do miss the fact that we couldn't hang out at Moose Jaw and sit in that nice little hot springs that they have there, and the great chicken wing place they have in town. So next time, Moose Jaw, we're all coming in and hanging out. Thanks for joining us. See you later.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne.